I would like your view on one of our top stories today, and a story that is one of those water cooler stories around the nation. What was your reaction after seeing that viral video of the arrest of the pregnant Ballarat woman yesterday?
Yeah, good afternoon, Ashley. This video is obviously very difficult to watch, and particularly if you are a parent or you yourself have been a pregnant mother, as many people watching would have been. And clearly a distressing situation. But what I do know from my time as a Premier is that the police often have to go into difficult circumstances and make difficult decisions. And really, I don't think it benefits anyone in the community if there is armchair commentary being provided. And so I think it's appropriate, and I welcome the fact that the Victorian Police have stepped up today to answer questions about what is clearly a very distressing situation for this family.
We have seen quite a bit of criticism from some quarters that some of the state premiers are having the powers given to them in the pandemic go to their heads. What do you make of that sort of criticism? As a former state premier, do you think there has been some overreach going on when it comes to increasing police powers and the border issue, for example?
Let's be clear that our state premiers are responsible for the health and well-being of their residents. They run the health systems. They are responsible to ensure that the health system continues to function and that residents stay as healthy as possible. And what I have seen right across Australia is state premiers of both Liberal and Labor stripes following the medical advice, listening to the experts, putting in place the measures they feel are necessary to protect their populations. And what we saw earlier in the week, Ashley, is a clear indication that the public in those states is quite supportive of those measures.
Do you fear that arrests like the one that we've just been talking about only strengthen the resolve of anti-lockdown movements, people who would like to be taking to the streets protesting these lockdowns?
What I would say to everyone in the community is we need now more than ever to be following the medical advice, to be following the restrictions that are in place. These things are being done in order to protect the health and well-being of everyone, but particularly for vulnerable older people who are most susceptible to coronavirus and are quite susceptible to some of the most significant and worst outcomes, including death. And what we have seen in the Senate this afternoon is the Senate take a decision to censure the aged care minister, Richard Colbeck, because of his failure to deal with the coronavirus outbreak in our aged care homes. Now, quite frankly, we should never have been in a circumstance where aged care workers only had one glove all day for infection control, where we go into this pandemic with aged care residents already in a state of neglect, as the Royal Commission found, and where we now are in a circumstance where the aged care minister ignored the warnings from the Northern Hemisphere, ignored the warnings of Newmarch House and Dorothy Henderson Lodge in New South Wales early on, and allowed this virus, this deadly virus for older Australians, to take hold in residential aged care.
There are still thousands of Australians overseas who do want to get home. If you were the minister, what would your approach be? Would you be scrapping the caps on numbers returning entirely? Wouldn't that be dangerous in terms of an influx stretching our quarantine and our health systems?
Actually, there are 23,000 Australians right now stranded overseas in the middle of a global pandemic. These are people who have been trying to come home and have been unable to do so. They're unable to do so because of the caps that Scott Morrison announced some 8 weeks ago. They're unable to do so because airlines are price gouging. They're unable to do so because the quarantine capacity isn't in place. Now, everything that happens at our borders, quarantine, international arrival numbers, being able to cross the border freely, as is the right of an Australian citizen, this is all a federal government responsibility. It is now beyond time, in the middle of this global pandemic, where we have 23,000 Australians stranded overseas trying to come home, for the Morrison government to have a plan to do this. Today in the Senate, Senator Wong and I will be calling on the government. We're asking the Senate to support our proposition to the government that they work immediately to increase the cap to allow stranded Australians to come home. No, let's not forget, Early on, they put in place the capacity to bring home people from Wuhan and to put them into quarantine run by the Commonwealth government. That can happen now. They should also be considering the range of options available to them, including chartering flights to go to places like Britain and India and the Philippines and Lebanon to bring stranded Australians home. Some 3,500.
Sorry, what would your policy be in terms of lifting that cap? You said you'd like to lift the cap. What numbers are you looking at? What would be a safe number in your view?
What we are saying is that there is the capacity within the Commonwealth government to be able to bring people home where they are stranded overseas. These are Australian citizens. These are people who have a right to come back to the country by right of being Australian citizens. And so what we are calling on the government to do is to act urgently to bring these 23,000 Australians home. This is not an ongoing lifting of the cap. This is a request, a demand, a heartfelt demand from Australians who are separated from their loved ones right now, from those Australians who are stranded overseas, that the Commonwealth government get a plan in place to be able to bring them home, to put them into quarantine.
Senator, the system couldn't handle 23,000 Australians arriving in the next few days. I mean, that just they wouldn't be able to cope.
Well, Ashley, quite frankly, Ashley, it doesn't need to be in the next 3 days, but the government don't even have a plan in place. It has been 8 weeks since they announced the caps. It has been since March some of these people have been trying to come home. The government has failed for months now to have a plan. What we are saying is get a plan in place to enable these 23,000 stranded Australians to, one, make their way back to Australia without being price gouged by airlines, and two, to be able to quarantine in order to ensure that their return is safe. After 6 months of this pandemic, where people have been, I have people who have contacted my office who have been trying since March to get home from various places around the world and have been unable to do so. 8 weeks after the cap has been announced, there's been no plan from this government to do its most basic function. Look out for Australians who are stranded overseas and enable them to come home in the middle of a global pandemic that has deadly consequences.
Kristina Keneally, I do want to ask you, we've seen stillbirth laws introduced into the House today. It'll see parents of stillborn babies allowed to take up to a year off work to grieve their child under these new workplace entitlements. This is something I know is very close to your heart, something you've worked towards for a long time now. How does it feel to finally get to this point for you?
Well, this is an important step forward. It is a part of the recommendation, Ashley, from the Senate inquiry into stillbirth that Labor established. And one of the most important things about the step that we're seeing today is that parents of stillborn babies will be acknowledged as parents. You know, I think many of your viewers may be aware that I myself am the mother of a stillborn baby, Caroline, some 2 decades ago. And quite sadly, so little has changed in 20 years. We haven't seen a reduction in the rate of stillbirth, and we have still seen attitudes, sadly, from some employers that the mother or the father of a stillborn baby isn't a parent. We heard heartbreaking stories in the Senate that a mother was being asked to return to work, required to return to work after just 11 days of giving birth after her stillborn baby. You know, this is a big step forward. There is so much more to be done in this space, particularly about bringing down the rate of stillbirth, but I do welcome this change.